Okay, excellent. Thanks, friends. Oh, yay, seeing wonderful people. Thank you so much for joining us today. All right, okay, we're gonna get started. So this is a presentation on the current kind of political reality in Bolivia and its relationship with the global health crisis. So Bolivia has experienced kind of a double state of emergency right now. We experienced a severe political upheaval late last year, starting in October, and that kind of led into the current global health crisis that we're facing. So I just want to share a bit of my personal experience of that journey. And I do want to put out just a disclaimer at the beginning by saying that I do not consider myself to be an expert. There are many people writing, really valuable and useful analyses about what's happening in Bolivia. There are many different stories. There's not just one single story about this reality. And more than kind of a deep political analysis, I'm really just going to be sharing a summary of events, what happened in Bolivia over the last 6 months, how does it relate to the current reality that we're living in today, how does the political situation influence the management of the global health pandemic, and this is really just from my own personal lived experience in Bolivia. So again, I'm not an expert. I am also, just want to acknowledge that I am a white woman. I'm a foreigner living in a country that has become my own, but I don't want to claim to speak any kind of single truth for Bolivia. And in order to bring in a little bit of a variety of perspectives, I have asked some friends to share some of their perspectives. So you'll see as we move through the presentation, there's a couple spots where I'm going to open up some video interviews that I did, just to hear a variety of voices. And also just to let you know, I'm going to be looking at my notes here next to me on a separate screen, so I might be shifting my attention here and there. I guess to get started, I do want to kind of engage people a little bit if they're willing to humor me by participating in the chat feature. For people who are joining us today and feel able to share in the chat box, how much experience do you have with Bolivia? Are you coming with a background? Are you new to this whole context? Yeah, let's hear from our audience, like just kind of their experience with this part of the world. So just a couple of brief comments if you can. Great, no experience. None but excited to learn. Oh, Helen, hello, darling, how are you? So we have some experts. Oh, Wallace, one of my old students is here. Wonderful to see you. Okay, so we have some folks that have participated on Dragon's programs. Anyone here who has participated in my development webinar? A month with Bolivia. We have some educator program attendees. 2029. Oh, hi Mahesh, how are you? Great, so we have a mix of people, and that's wonderful. Some of you are going to really relate to some of these images and experiences, and for those of you that are new to Bolivia and to this story, I'm going to try to keep it, try to give you some background and some context so you know what we're talking about. And someone, oh, hi Elizabeth, nice to see you. Great. Do folks have, before I jump in, do folks have any questions that they came to the presentation with that I should try to address as we move through? I don't see anything popping up right away, but like I said, if questions come up, I'll try to keep engaged with the chat box. And again, there'll be some time at the end for a question and answer. All right, wonderful. So we are going to get going. Oops, and I'm pressing next slide. Oh, there we go. All right, a coup or not a coup, the fall of Evo Morales and political transformation in Bolivia in times of pandemic. So yeah, that is a huge subtitle. This is a huge topic that we're delving into today. We could do a whole webinar series on just one element of what's unfolded in Bolivia in the last few months. So, that means I'm going to do kind of a rapid summary to give some of the context. There's no way to do justice to such a big topic. It's very, very complex, very nuanced. So I'm just going to do my best to give you kind of an outline. And like I said, this is from my own personal experience moving through this. Let's see. Yeah, I think as I introduce the talk, Bolivia, like I said, is experiencing two different crises at once. And while that may feel really unique right now, I do also think that the global situation that we're living in has really urgent messages and lessons for all of us as we manage these, navigate these unprecedented circumstances. And experiences of crisis really start to tell us who we are as a people, not just as individuals, but also, as communities, as countries. And, this is an important time for us to reflect on our values, how they relate to our country of origin, where we live, how we navigate those relationships. And I do think that there are some important parallels happening in Bolivia with, say, the political situation in the United States right now. So I do hope that we can bring some connection back to our own lives and experiences, especially for those of you that are in the US. Something that I think a lot of us are navigating right now are uncertainty, maybe lack of transparency about what's going on and how it's being handled, looking at how the most vulnerable populations are being impacted by the global health crisis, and how is that aggravated in a time of political emergency as well. I would say that right now in Bolivia, history is being rewritten. Okay, so this is a huge historical moment, not just because of COVID-19, but because of the situation that the country was experiencing when the pandemic broke out. And so there's really urgent and important questions right now about who we are. What is this new narrative that's being written? And how can we influence it? And how can we raise the voices of people who aren't always heard in these experiences of crisis? So to give you a little bit of background on who I am, for those of you who don't know me, I am the Latin America Program Director with Dragons. I've been living in Bolivia since 2009, but had a relationship with Bolivia and with the region well before that. And for that I can give thanks to my mama, who's here on this call. So thanks, Mom. I've had kind of a love affair with Latin America, I would say, my whole life. My educational background is in anthropology, Latin American studies. I have a master's in international development. And so, I bring to this conversation, I think, a multi-lens of like anthropologist. As an educator, I am an experiential educator. That's what I do, and that has been my relationship with Dragons for these past many years. I started instructing with Dragons in the field in 2011, and since 2012 have been a program director. And so I'm bringing kind of all of those experiences and lenses, and then of course my own personal journey of spending more than a decade in Bolivia. I'm raising my children here. My partner is Bolivian, and so it's also a very personal story for me as well. Some of you who know me also know that when I speak about things that I'm passionate about, I tend to get carried away. And so I'm asking you all to keep me on track. And so if you think I need to kind of move ahead, just give me a little message and I'll see that and I can continue on. What else can I say? Like I said, there are a lot of experts who are writing and producing material and information about Bolivia, so I can refer you to those people. I can send some information after the webinar for those of you that are interested. People like Maria Galindo, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, Raquel Gutierrez, Raul Cevechi. I mean, these are all intellectuals who have been writing on, the crisis. And again, I'm not an expert. I just am humbled to share my own personal experience with you. Let's see. I think I want to add to that Bolivia right now is living a moment of extreme polarization, extreme polarization, especially when it comes to the political situation. There are a lot of divisions along class lines, race lines, and ethnicity. There's a lot of regional differentiation in how this has been experienced. And so, you know, my perspective is my own perspective. Obviously, there's many other stories, and so I just want to, I just want to mention that that it's going to be slanted according to kind of my own lens and my experience of the world and my experience of this situation. Okay. All right. So getting right into it, I just wanted to give some background on Bolivia. Actually, I do have one more thing to add. I am the mother to 2 small children, and they are here at the house, given these crazy times we're living in where we don't have childcare. And so it may be a possibility that you'll hear a baby or a child's voice. We'll try to keep them occupied, but I just want to let you know that might come up as we move through the presentation. Okay, so the Plurinational State of Bolivia. For those of you that haven't spent time here, I just wanted to give kind of some context for the place that we're speaking about. So Bolivia is an Andean nation. We're right in the heart of South America. It's a very, very diverse country, often known for its large indigenous population. So Bolivia has the largest per capita indigenous population in South America. I think in the Western Hemisphere. So that's a big part of the identity in Bolivia. When I speak of indigenous population, we're not speaking about one single people. There are 37 different ethnic groups, languages, worldviews, ways of living and experiencing the world. So hence the name Plurinational State of Bolivia, which we can thank Evo Morales for that name. It is a country highlighted by extreme cultural and ecological diversity. It's spectacularly beautiful. And
Hey.
Was there a question? I just heard a voice. Okay, I'll keep going.
Come on.
And I would also say a big part of
Where's your ball?
The Bolivian.
Where's your ball?
I'm going to ask folks to mute yourselves just so that we don't have outside noise coming through. Thank you. One aspect that's really salient in Bolivia is a long history of resistance, of political mobilization. I would say Bolivia is one of the most politicized countries in Latin America, which is saying a lot. And people have long political memory here, going all the way back to the colonial period and the Spanish conquest. There are figures in Bolivia in society, like, for example, Tupac Katari, who fought against the Spanish conquest. These rebellions are part of the people. They run in the veins and the blood and identity of who Bolivians are. And so that's just an important thing to know about, you know, political memory in this part of the world. Another important factor is that Bolivia has the largest informal economy in the world. There was a recent World Bank study done that actually confirmed that. What does that mean, informal economy? It means that a large majority of the population are self-employed, meaning they are vendors, small businesses, commerce. They sell agricultural products or goods in the street. Maybe they have small factories in their homes. But that means that the vast majority of the population is not, of the economy is not regulated in any way. It also means that people don't have a lot of social security nets to fall back on in moments of crisis like we're experiencing right now. So there's no such thing as collecting unemployment in Bolivia. You know, there's a lot of people that live day to day. Okay, so we are now in month 3 of a really strict lockdown and quarantine related to the COVID pandemic, and that is catastrophic for people who live day to day. So that's important to understand about the context that we're living in. Bolivia is also known for a high degree of political instability. There have been, I think, almost 200 coups and revolutions in Bolivian history. I saw something recently on the Washington Post that said that people protest more often in Bolivia than any other country. So I don't know if that is factual, but it is definitely, you know, a part of who we are. I put this note here on kind of the three curses, and that comes from a book written by an economist named Paul Collier several years back, and he wrote a book on what he called the bottom billion. And the bottom billion were essentially people around the world who were living in states of poverty who weren't being reached by conventional development initiatives. And he identified a number of countries around the world where you know, where there were factors really limiting the ability for people to come out of poverty. And some of those factors he highlights in his book are landlocked nations, especially tend to struggle. Landlocked nations that have poor relationships with their neighbors. He calls it bad neighbors, the bad neighbor trap. So that is something that is absolutely true for Bolivia. Bolivia has lost wars to all, if not almost all of its neighbors. It's lost significant land to all its neighbors. It has a very, very controversial relationship with Chile, for example. It lost a big war to the Chaco War, to Paraguay. So it's a country that it has experienced significant restrictions to its economic growth as a result of being landlocked. Secondly, Paul Collier highlights the natural resource curse. So oftentimes countries who are rich in natural resources really struggle with economic stability. It's kind of this irony, right? That there's such a wealth of natural resources in Bolivia, which has actually really made political stability and economic stability extremely elusive. And then finally, Paul Collier speaks of the conflict trap or the governance trap. Like I said, there's been a long history of political instability for many reasons and many factors. I would say a lot of them having to do with people wanting to access some of the resources here. And that has led to, you know, long periods of political instability, dictatorship, and therefore poor governance. So there are all sorts of factors that have kind of tied Bolivia down in terms of its national sovereignty, and in terms of, you know, in terms of thriving. And for that reason, it's also often known as a country that is a high rate of poverty. I challenge you, maybe this is a little exercise you can do after the webinar. If you open virtually any English language news article or information about Bolivia, it will almost always begin with Bolivia, comma, the poorest country in South America. So that kind of messaging impacts a country, it impacts a people. That is the story that Bolivians are told about themselves all the time. And that is only one very small part of the story, which I'm going to continue to discuss today. And there are a lot of divisions in this country as a result of the diversity, as a result of some of these injustices that I've started to highlight. There's significant class divisions. Bolivia has a very high income inequality. And interestingly enough, a lot of these divisions are marked by geography. So as you move geographically through spaces in Bolivia, there's different cultural identities, there's different spiritual identities, and I'll talk a bit more about that. I put at the bottom here that Bolivia is a land of superlatives as well. So you often hear of, you know, the biggest indigenous population, or the highest, you know, it's part of the highest mountain, the longest mountain chain on earth, some of the highest mountains in the Andes. There's all this kind of language of superlatives surrounding this country. And I wanted to share just a little anecdote that I think highlights some of kind of this story that's been told for a long time about Bolivia. Recently, I was traveling with my family. We were in Peru several months ago, and my husband was hanging out with my daughter at a park, and she overheard some travelers in Peru having a conversation about Bolivia. And one of the travelers looked at this woman who was North American and said, "Oh, you went to Bolivia. So what was it like?" And she kind of thought and considered for a moment. She said, "So poor and so beautiful." And so that is, that is often the story that is told about Bolivia, and I want to tell a more descriptive, a more nuanced story about this place. Let's see, what else can I add? 62% of the population in Bolivia identifies as indigenous. Obviously, that's a little bit of a difficult question, depends on how you're asking that question, but it's more than half of the population. And yeah, we'll move on. Okay. So a couple of images to highlight the geographical divisions that I mentioned. You have the Andes on one side, on the western half of the country. Bolivia is often associated with Andes, tall mountains, llamas, kind of all these images we get about Bolivia. But actually, about 60% of the country, of the landmass of Bolivia, is in the lowlands. So those are tropical areas, a huge swath of Amazon rainforest, a lot of dry savanna. And these divisions are really salient in Bolivia. So in the mountains, in the highlands, in the western region, you have the largest percentage of indigenous people in the country, predominantly made up of Aymara and Quechua, people of Aymara and Quechua descent, and they tend to occupy the highlands and mountainous regions. In the eastern part of the country, you have, first of all, a lot of the natural resource wealth. So a lot of the gas, well, pretty much all of the gas, oil, the hydrocarbon reserves are in the eastern part of the country. Obviously, there's, the Amazon rainforest, which there's a lot of, people trying to exploit that region for different reasons. There's a huge soy production in the eastern part of the country, which soy and cattle are the biggest cause of deforestation in the Amazon. So this huge agro-industrial complex in eastern Bolivia means that that's where a lot of the economic wealth is situated. It also just so happens that the people, especially in urban spaces in eastern Bolivia, tend to be whiter. And so you have kind of this racial division as well. So a lot of the economic resources and wealth and huge land ownings are in the eastern part of Bolivia. And then in the western area, you have more, the Aymara and Quechua indigenous populations, and also the seat of government. Bolivia has two capitals, actually. The official capital is Sucre in the Chuquisaca department, and Sucre is kind of considered the old seat of oligarchy. It's where the independence was signed. It's the seat of the Supreme Court and the judicial sector of the government. And then La Paz is the seat of government. And there's often a lot of tension historically between Sucre and La Paz. And that's really a class division, I would say. When Evo came to power in 2000, when he was elected in 2005, there was a huge response in the eastern swath of the country in protest against the election of Evo Morales, and there was even a lot of talk about separatism and the creation of a separate state. So there's a very significant divide there geographically. And then right back in the middle of the country, you have the central highlands. So this is where I'm located. This image here is the city of Cochabamba. I live outside of the city of Cochabamba, kind of off this image, but off in the hillside. And this is both the center of the country geographically. It's the center of the entire continent of South America. So I'm right in the heart of it. And it's also kind of in the center politically. It's in the center geographically, right? Just a few hours east of Cochabamba, you're dropping down into the lowlands, into the Amazon, and just, going 15 minutes west or an hour, a couple hours west, you're getting higher up into the Andes. So I'm speaking to you today right from the middle of the country geographically, but also politically. And this has been kind of a key, I would say, war ground for the political crisis that emerged last fall. What else? Yeah, I think that's all I'll say there. Okay. So who is Evo Morales Aima? For most of you on this call, I'm sure you have some familiarity with this figure. Very controversial, very charismatic, someone who led the country for the last 14 years. That's the longest continual governance in Bolivia's history. Evo is a popular leader, the first indigenous president in Bolivian history, and someone who was a massive, huge symbol of hope for so many people when he came to power in the early 2000s. So just to give you a little taste, I mean, it's just his whole persona is a huge topic to explore, but just to give kind of a little introduction to who he is, Evo Morales is from the Highlands. He became nationally known as a cocolero union leader in the Chapare region in Cochabamba, where he grew coca leaves. And he really emerged as a national figure with this kind of anti-imperialist rhetoric. And that was key, really, after a long period of neoliberalism and structural adjustment in Bolivia that created very deep social and economic inequalities. There's this language, for those of you who have participated in my development talk, there's this idea that in the early 2000s, there was kind of a moral consciousness, which with the world entered the 20th century. And I would say that Evo Morales kind of rode that wave without knowing it even at the time. There was a series of very important things that happened in Bolivia around that period. There was the water revolt in the year 2000, which reversed the privatization of water as a public good in the city of Cochabamba. That was the first time that had ever happened in any country in the world. So that was a huge public uprising that resulted in the reversal of that privatization. There was also the legacy of the drug war in Bolivia. So we're coming off of a period where coca growers growing the coca leaf had been demonized, criminalized. The US government came in with a huge budget and a huge plan to eliminate coca in Bolivia, and they targeted small farmers. So this wasn't a plan to target people who were involved in drug trafficking or the drug trade in any way. They were people growing coca leaf for their survival. Maybe some of that went to drug production, but some of it also went to traditional use in Bolivia. Coca is considered a very sacred and medicinal plant here. During the drug war in Bolivia, there was a very ugly and violent period where campesinos and peasants were targeted, it was a very dark period. And so Evo Morales came out of resistance to that form of imperialism. There was also the gas war in Bolivia, which I won't go into too much detail now, but there was a national uprising in 2003 after the Bolivian government instituted a series of structural adjustment reforms that made it more difficult for working class people to survive. And so there was a big uprising in the streets of El Alto, and it was repressed violently by the then president Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, known as Goni, who was a Western North American educated president who had to flee the country in the face of this national uprising. And in that void, after Goni's departure, is where Evo became a national figure. It's important to mention that Evo's anti-imperialist discourse was so popular that he actually joked that the US ambassador to Bolivia was his campaign, was kind of the head of his campaign, because when the US ambassador came out and started denouncing Evo as a leader in Bolivia, his popularity surged. It just exploded. And it absolutely shocked the nation and the world when Evo was elected in 2005 with 54% of the popular vote. So that is a huge landslide. He was just a symbol of something that had never happened in this country before. And for the majority of indigenous people, or majority of people in Bolivia, to look at the president and see their faces reflected in that figure was so empowering. Not only that, but he was a huge advocate for for conservation, for the rights of Mother Earth. He passed a law that was constitutionalized, protecting the rights of Mother Earth, and that was unprecedented. That had never happened before. I would say that, you know, Evo definitely lost track of some of those promises and values significantly over the period of his leadership, but this origin story is really essential to understand what happened later. So I have a quote here that says, in 2006, I entered the presidential palace in La Paz as the first indigenous president of Bolivia. Our government, under the slogan, Bolivia Changes, is committed to ending the colonialism, racism, and exclusion that many of our people have lived under for many centuries. So that is true. That really speaks truth to the history and the reality that he stepped into. And again, that was a huge symbol of hope. I added here this line at the top, volveré y seré millones. So this comes from this this legacy of Evo Morales essentially trying to embody the figure of Tupac Katari, who was a revolutionary indigenous Aymara leader during the Spanish colonial period. He led a huge uprising against the Spanish. He sieged the city of La Paz for 6 months. This is in the 1780s. And when that rebellion was ultimately squashed by the Spanish, they ended up violently executing Tupac Katari by quartering his body. They had 4 horses tied to his arms and legs, and they tore his body apart and then sent it to different parts of the empire. This is pre-Republic, as a symbol of what will happen if the indigenous people rose up. And before, there's this kind of really legendary story that before Tupac Katari was killed, he said, "I will be back, and I will be millions." And so when Evo became a national figure, he really kind of embodied this return of indigenous rule. And that was the language that he used. I am the reincarnation of Tupac Katari. I recently realized, as I was doing my research for this presentation, that Tupac was killed November 13th in 1781. And Evo fled the country on November 11th of last year. So I think it's pretty symbolic that somebody who tried to kind of like rebirth indigenous leadership in not just for Bolivia or the Andes or for the world, almost to the day they fell. I think that's powerful. A lot of people consider that Evo's first term, his first 5 years were the best, probably the best presidential term in Bolivian history. That's obviously more for folks who are leaning on the progressive side of things, I would say, but the transformation that he implemented during that first term was really significant. He implemented a partial nationalization of natural resources in Bolivia. I say partial because it was not complete, but there was a renegotiation of contracts that allowed the Bolivian people to stay with a larger share, a majority of the earnings from mining and gas and other extractive industries that have always been the backbone of the Bolivian economy. He created very important social bonus systems and kind of social support systems for key sectors of the population who hadn't received that support in the past. And those bonuses actually lifted a huge sector of people out of poverty and extreme poverty in Bolivia. He founded the Plurinational State. So the name of Bolivia was actually changed from the Republic of Bolivia to the Plurinational State of Bolivia, recognizing the diversity of the people who make up this nation. And he created a new constitution, which was one of the most progressive constitutions that the world had ever seen. And in that constitution was enshrined the rights of Pachamama, the rights of Mother Earth, which was something that nobody had ever, had ever put forth before. And there was just a real empowering of different social movements and sectors of the population in Bolivia that hadn't had that kind of platform. So this is the first time in history that you're seeing indigenous people occupy, public positions in government, indigenous women in their traditional dress. And that was a very significant shift from essentially, years, hundreds of years of being ruled by a white oligarchic elite. So Evo's time in office led to the longest period of economic stability in the country's history, which is significant for a country that has had a lot of economic instability. And he was responsible for, you know, extreme poverty dropped massively from almost 40% to 15%. And the percentage of people just living in poverty in general in Bolivia fell from 60% in 2006 to 34% in 2017. So that is significant. I would say during his second term, Evo really lost track of kind of what he embodied and what he stood for. There was kind of some nefarious tendencies that began during that period that really just deepened in the 10 years following that. So there's not time in this presentation to get into that in too much detail, but the longer Evo was power, the more he deviated from the original promises that he had made, which is not unusual, right, when people are in positions of power. Okay. So to give you just some brief points about kind of the crisis of the MAS party, MAS is Evo's political party, the Movimiento al Socialismo, movement towards socialism. And it's also known as kind of the decadencia. It entered into a period of complete decadence, you could say. So first of all, I think that he's been very massively criticized for an overdependence on extractive industries. So for someone who really promoted the rights of Mother Earth and this whole discourse of kind of protecting the environment and the diversity in Bolivia, that became just merely words. It was not at all backed up in action. And in fact, there were many excursions into national parks and indigenous territories. It was a complete onslaught, essentially. So in some ways, no different from some of his neoliberal predecessors. One significant problem was the politicization and coercion and exploitation of social movements. So essentially, Bolivia has had a long history of social movement mobilization, and those social movements essentially became tools of the apparatus of the MAS. So essentially, Evo was kind of their leader, just as he had been the Coca union movement leader, and he told people what to do and how to vote, and essentially the leaders of different sectors of these social movements had to comply. And that is really an erosion of democratic systems and the legacy of resistance and autonomy in this country. Manipulation of democratic processes, because Evo never should have been able to run for a fourth term in office in the first place. And in fact, that is unconstitutional. So after approving a new constitution in 2009, that was when Evo was already finishing his second term. And the law in Bolivia is that you can serve only 2 consecutive terms. Because he had ratified a new constitution, he essentially said, okay, well, this is a new constitution, it's a new country, it's a new name, and so I'm gonna run again, and it's actually gonna be my first term under the new constitution. And he was able to do that. So he ran for a third term in 2009. Again, he won by landslide victory. So in 2009, I think it was 64% of the vote. So probably the most popular president that this region had ever seen, even, you know, going into his second and third terms. There was a referendum that happened in 2016, in February of 2016, where essentially Evo came to the people and said, well, you let me run again for a fourth term. And they decided to do a referendum. We all went to the ballot box, we all voted. Essentially, there were 2 boxes on the ballot, and it was yes or no, okay? And by a very, very short margin, the people voted not to allow Evo to run to a fourth term. So he lost by 51% of the vote. Again, that's a very, very, very tiny margin. and that essentially meant that he couldn't run for a fourth term. He completely bypassed the results of that referendum, and subsequently he actually manipulated the Supreme Court, the national courts, to give him permission to run again. And the way they did that was by having the Supreme Court say that it was his human right to run for another term in office. So there was a very complex series of events behind that, but that's kind of a quick summary. Another significant thing was just the expansion of agro-industrial territory. So a very important element in Bolivia is the notion of indigenous communal territory. And he expanded that to actually mean not just indigenous territory, but campesino or peasant territory. And that was actually a strategic way to allow his base, which was made up of coca farmers, to be able to expand their area of production. And that actually meant excursions into subtropical territories in the eastern part of the country that traditionally have been ancestral land to lowland indigenous populations. So Evo may represent the highland indigenous populations, but there are 34 different ethnic populations and smaller groups in lowland territories in Bolivia who have historically not felt represented by Evo's presidency. And that was really significant during the Tipnis conflict that emerged in 2011. So the image that you're seeing here on the screen is from the Tipnis March. I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but essentially the Bolivian government wanted to construct a highway that was going to bisect a national park and indigenous territory, and it was unconstitutional to move forward with any development project without consulting the communities that would be affected. And Evo Morales moved ahead to approve the construction of this highway project, and the lowland indigenous populations and their allies rose up en masse in protest against that decision. There was a march of tens of thousands of people who walked from the Amazon all the way to La Paz. It took them almost 2 months, thousands of kilometers in protest, and there was a widespread, national support for those marchers in the country. And unfortunately, they faced pretty brutal repression by the police in a place called Chaparina before they were able to reach the city of La Paz. So then this is a reality where you had Evo Morales, an indigenous president, approving the repression, the violent repression of lowland indigenous groups, and he never recovered from that decision. Okay, so that was probably the biggest single stain on his legacy, possibly up until recently. So that meant a huge loss of support. And then I have this quote here from one of our dear friends, Don Rafa Puente, who's an historian in Bolivia, and he works with a lot of our student groups giving talks and presentations. He speaks a lot about la borrachera del poder, which is essentially just this, like, the drunkenness of power, it evolved to a situation where Evo would just do anything he could to keep hold of power, and that blinded him from other realities in the country and the party itself. So that takes us to the elections of October of last year. So October 20th, here I am submitting my ballot. Election day is kind of like a family holiday in Bolivia. There are no cars permitted on the roads. People all walk to their neighborhood schools to vote. It's a kind of very family-friendly day. You stay home, you take your kids out to ride their bikes. And this was kind of the climate with which we all went to the polls last October. I would say that I had no doubt, at least personally at the time, that Evo was going to be reelected. It didn't seem to me that there were any other candidates that had enough popular support to beat him. And I think a lot of people were just resigned to the fact that we were going to have another term with Evo. And yes, that was constitutionally not legal. It raised a lot of questions about kind of the health of democracy in the country. And at the same time, there had been such a long period of social and political and economic stability. I think that there was kind of this general feeling that was inevitable. So we were, a lot of us were really shocked by what happened subsequently. So the elections went, mostly smoothly throughout the day, and then heading into evening, about 83% of the votes had been counted, and the ballots had closed for the day. And this is where we were at. So it was looking like Evo was going to win with 45% of the vote, with 83% of ballots tallied. Something happened in this moment that was the spark plug for everything that came later. So essentially, it was evening. I think it was maybe around 8 o'clock at night, and all of a sudden the quick count, which was kind of the quick tally that we were seeing on TV, was turned off. Up until now, nobody knows exactly why that happened, but there was some decision that was made somewhere to stop the quick count, which stopped kind of the public counting of the ballots. Now, in order for a president in Bolivia to win without having to have a runoff, he has to win by more than 10% above the nearest opponent. So as you can see in this 83%, Evo had just under the margin that he would have needed to avoid a runoff. Here we have Carlos Mesa, who's a well-known historian in Bolivia. He was a vice president to Goni, who I mentioned previously, and he was actually briefly the president of Bolivia when Goni fled in 2003. It didn't last very long. He was only president for about a year, but he's kind of a figure that everybody knows because we see him on TV doing documentaries and doing other programs on history in Bolivia. When the quick count stopped, it looked likely that there was going to have to be a runoff, and that would have been a real challenge for the Mass Party because it's not clear that they would have been able to win straight out in a runoff. This stopping of the quick count led to accusations of fraud, and a huge, massive scandal that resulted in Evo's resignation and fleeing the country. That is a whole complicated story, so I'm going to give as brief of a summary as I can. And I'm not going to get into kind of the technicalities and the nitty-gritty. I will say that the quick count is actually not the legal tally. There is a more formal tally that continues, into the next days. That is the legal final number that is formally recognized in Bolivia. When the quick count got turned off, there was kind of a period of radio silence. And then the next day, when it was reactivated, it just so happened that Evo was winning by 10.5%. So there was a 0.5% margin that would have allowed him to prevent the runoff. And essentially, the Mass Party came out and declared victory and, considered, okay, that was that. We have won the election. Little did they know that there was huge dissatisfaction stirring, and almost immediately there were national protests all over the country, and people denouncing what they really saw as fraud. Now, up until now, I would say there's no really reliable evidence that points to fraudulent elections. I can't say at all with any certainty that there wasn't, but I will say that it doesn't seem. There hasn't been any convincing evidence put forth so far, and there have been a number of audits and studies that have been done, including by MIT. So the Organization of Electoral Observation Mission, the OAS in Bolivia, they come out. They were kind of observing the elections and the transparency of the elections. They come out after the quick count was stopped and make an announcement saying that it is deeply concerning and surprising to see the drastic and hard to explain change in the trend of preliminary results from the quick count revealed after the closing of the polls. So this announcement by the OAS really lends credibility to the allegations of fraud, and that's significant. The OAS OAS is it's supposed to be an apolitical organization observing the elections, but that statement was, I think, pretty critical in putting more momentum behind these protests and behind the allegations of fraud. So this leads to a real crisis of legitimacy in Bolivia. And I will say that it seemed pretty evident that there was kind of a whole apparatus behind the scenes, really on the side of the opposition, on more kind of conservative sectors of society that were 100% prepared to take advantage of this lack of credibility and this crisis of legitimacy. So, I think there are elements of what happened later that were spontaneous and kind of people going out and taking to the streets and saying, we will not accept Evo for another term. But there was also definitely a very strategic amount of work and expenditure that had already been put in place to discredit Evo Morales as a candidate. And that was activated very quickly during that period. So moving along, are you all still with me? Am I boring you to death? Folks are okay? Okay, thank you. So this leads to what is called, what is now known as the Rebelión de las Pititas. So what are las Pititas? So what happened across the country is that there was a popular protest that literally paralyzed the country for 3 weeks. I mean, this is a really big deal. For 3 weeks, you could not go anywhere. For a lot of people, you could not leave your neighborhood. There were no cars able to transit freely on the roads. All interdepartmental borders were completely shut down. No goods were getting in and out of any major cities. And this was all a popular protest. These were neighborhood associations, individuals, people coming out and literally blockading their streets. And the image that you see here, this is a photo that I took as I was walking around the city one day during this period of the rebellion. And it's really just haphazard barriers that were constructed, I would say, on almost every street corner in parts of major cities, and especially the case in Cochabamba. So these aren't necessarily kind of violent protests or mass numbers of people out in the streets. There were significant checkpoints where there were more people. This was very, very highly organized. People were running shifts. There were people cooking for the protesters, and this was a multi-sector mobilization. So there were young people out, there were students, etc. But I will say that there was a significant representation by the middle and upper classes. Okay, so if you were experiencing this rebellion and you were in a wealthier neighborhood, that is where it was most alive and it was most vibrant. And it definitely was not the case in more working class neighborhoods, in the countryside, or in indigenous communities. And I think it's important to highlight that even though it felt like this was a nationally lived experience, it was a very urban uprising. And so, it's very common that cities can kind of create the new narrative and create the new story, and this kind of sentiment that this is happening in every corner of the country. But it was a rebellion that was very, very urban based and really, really situated in middle and upper class neighborhoods. I will say that important sectors that had previously been part of Evo's base did also come out in support of this movement, and that included, that included the COP, the Bolivia Workers Union, which was a significant part of Evo's support system previously. Some sectors of indigenous populations came out vocally and publicly against Evo's reelection, and there was a multi-sector element to this protest. Now, this term petitas actually refers to just little cords or strings or wires that people put up to block the streets, and there's kind of this sentiment of pride amongst people who were active in the protest that we took down the president peacefully with just pititas, with just a little wire in the road, right? So this, it was very different, I would say, from prior mobilizations and uprisings in Bolivia, in the sense that it was, you know, very kind of strategic, neighborhood-based, people just coming out and putting barriers on their roads. It wasn't this like bloody, massive upheaval, okay? But on the next slide, I will mention that there were important exceptions to that were very violent and very ugly. Now, there are some figures who emerge as very key leaders in this process, and those were mostly headed by civic committees. So in each major city in Bolivia, there are these comités cívicos, which are essentially associations of business owners, I would say. And so it is a representation of kind of the business class in the country. And there were two civic committee leaders, one of Santa Cruz, whose name is Fernando Camacho, and one of Potosí, Pumari, who came out as kind of the faces of this movement. And I'm going to talk a bit more about them later. But they were very strategically, I would say, you know, pulling cords and moving around resources to make this happen. Fernando Camacho is somebody who was not known on the national scene in Bolivia prior to this uprising, and he's actually part of the white power movement in Santa Cruz. So this is an overtly racist and fascist organization in the Santa Cruz department in Bolivia, and he became the face of this rebellion. And it's no accident that it was on a very racist platform and very anti-Indigenous platform. So there was a surge of, unfortunately, racism in the country, and kind of this feeling that a lot of the gains and very significant gains that were made during the period of Evo's leadership were just very rapidly being lost. And all of a sudden, the feeling of pride that had been gained by walking down the street and being a cholita, or being an indigenous woman, or being from, you know, an indigenous background, all of a sudden that became something that you could be attacked for. And that was occurring. There were instances of indigenous people being attacked in the streets. You know, there was, we heard anecdotes of people, if you were in, like, say, a traffic altercation, all of a sudden, instead of saying like, oh, you know, screw you or whatever, it was, oh, you masista de mierda. So it became a derogatory term to be associated with the mass party, and to be associated with the mass party, which was to be associated as an Indio, as an indigenous person. There were significant events of xenophobia. So for example, I had friends and people in my community who went out to show support for peaceful protest, and they were targeted as being infiltrators, as being, you know, spies, as being Venezuelan and Argentinian spies who were trying to manipulate the sovereignty of the Bolivian people. So I personally felt during this period that it wasn't safe for me to go outside of my house or take my children out of the house. This was a very, very, very scary time. And significantly, we saw the formation of paramilitary groups in Bolivia, really kind of for the first time at such a significant scale. So I put the example here of RJTC, the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala. This was a movement that emerged in the city of Cochabamba, where you had men who were not associated with the police or armed forces or government, who decided to take to the streets and take the security situation into their own hands. And taking security into their own hands in some cases meant really terrorizing people, spreading fear into neighborhoods. There was a lot of paranoia, and there was these images that we were seeing on, you know, on TV and on social media of hundreds and hundreds of men with weapons on motorcycles taking to the streets and terrorizing people, and especially in working class neighborhoods. And I also want to highlight the role of social media. It definitely felt like this was a battle that was being fought online. Okay, so people are closed up in their houses, not so dissimilar to what we're experiencing now with the public health crisis. You know, this was the information you were getting was coming from social media. There was an incredible explosion of misinformation being spread around. It actually emerged later that something like 170,000 fake Twitter and Instagram accounts were created during the protest in order to lend support to this Rebelión de las Pititas and the call for Evo to resign. So there was a lot of kind of tense battles being fought, you know, through the medium of, you know, of screens and social media, which I think is a new reality that we're living in today. Okay. So I did mention that although this was largely a peaceful protest, there were some significant instances of violence, and I would say very clearly on both sides. There was violence and vandalism committed on both sides. There was a feeling of chaos, of uncertainty, of scarcity. So major cities in the country were being cut off. They couldn't get goods to markets. Things like gas were scarce and key food items. This kind of very real feeling that we were on the verge of catastrophe, essentially. A couple of important instances to mention. So here on the top right, you have the mayor of Vinto, which is a town right near Cochabamba. This was Patricia Arce, who is a Mass mayor and representative. She was essentially tarred and feathered. I mean, this was an atrocious event that happened. She was pulled out of the mayor's office in Vinto. She had her hair cut off. She had paint poured all over her body. She was dragged several kilometers through the streets, bleeding. Her feet were bleeding. They were telling her, "We are going to kill you." And this was all merely as a result of essentially being associated with the Mass Party and lending support to sectors of Mass during this political crisis. And this was instigated by members of this paramilitary group that I mentioned, the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala. Now, this group has continued to be a presence in Cochabamba since the crisis already passed, and there's very real issues and problems associated with paramilitary groups in our streets. And in fact, several human rights groups have come out and called for the disintegration of these paramilitary groups that have their own counterparts in major cities across the country. And again, I just want to highlight, this was terrifying. This was a terrifying time. It felt like you didn't know who you could trust. It felt like you were going to be targeted one way or another just walking outside of your front door. There were nights where, you know, there were rumors being spread that, you know, they're coming to your neighborhood, they're going to break into your house. You know, there's very, very real fear and uncertainty during this period. Okay. I do want to acknowledge that we did get a little bit of a late start, but we're already an hour in. So just to mention that this webinar is being recorded. If for whatever reason you want to reconnect, view it later, we can make a link available. But I am going to go for a bit longer just to give you all a heads up. I hope you're not bored yet. So this, you know, things were changing in Bolivia by the minute during this period. I mean, we were all just glued to our screens, glued to the news. It just felt like every single day there was new information coming out, new changes that were happening. And very, very quickly, we found ourselves facing Evo's resignation and departure from the country. So to talk a bit about how that came about, after 3 weeks of kind of these uprisings where streets were closed and roads were closed across the country, there got to be a kind of a tipping point where something kind of had to give. And on the evening of November 9th, I want to say, the police in the city of Cochabamba mutinied. So the police came out and deceived their leader, Evo Morales, and there was a huge mutiny in Cochabamba, and then that spread to other major cities across the country. And I just remember being glued to my chair, seeing this unfold. When the armed forces turn, that is a major shift in any kind of crisis. Okay, so they mutinied in Cochabamba, and then in Tarija, in Sucre, ultimately also in Banda, in El Pando, in Beni, and I believe also in Santa Cruz. So that was really kind of the beginning of the end for Evo. And then significantly, there were sectors of Evo's indigenous base that also came out and joined the protests. So I have here a quote from, this is the Manifiesto, the Manifest from the Caracara Nation. This is an indigenous group that came out and said, "Mr. President, from the bottom of our hearts and with great regret, we say to you, where did you get lost? Why did you not live within the ancestral precepts that say that we must respect the circle of leadership? Only once must we govern. Why have you prostituted our Pachamama, our Mother Earth? Why did you send the Chiquitania to be burned? Why did you mistreat our indigenous brothers in Chaparina and Tariquia?" So even though, you know, there were very kind of conservative and racist sectors that instigated this uprising and this movement, we do have to acknowledge that there were, you know, important sectors of Evo's base that also came out against him. I see a question that came in. What was the impetus for the police to turn against Evo? You know, I'm not sure that we'll ever know the answer to that question. I think it's a very complex one. I do know that I was impressed actually to see the restraint that was practiced by the government during this period. They easily, and a lot of governments would have gone out and quelled the protests, you know, by the use of force, and that never happened. In the 21 days, there was not any direct call for the police to repress protesters in any way. There was, you know, I think a lot of restraint that was practiced. But I think maybe sectors of the police felt like Evo's fall was inevitable and it was time for them to put their support behind it. However, you know, I think it's probably possible that there was financial impetus. We do know that there was a lot of money and resources being spread around, including these paramilitary groups were being paid, okay? So it actually came out publicly that there were, you know, young men from working class neighborhoods who had joined these paramilitary groups because they were getting paid 200 Bolivianos a day to go out and terrorize people on the streets. So I would say that in sectors of the police, there was probably, you know, a personal political and or economic incentive, but I can't answer that question completely. So another key, so on, you know, on November 8th, the police mutiny begins. On November 9th, the OAS, the Organization of American States that had agreed to do an independent audit of the election, comes out publicly. They release their preliminary report citing irregularities. I have never seen the complete and final OAS report. I do know that at no time do they state categorically that there was fraud in the election, but they do come out on November 9th and say that there were irregularities in the voting processes. And that was really, I think, just kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So once the OAS lends credibility to these allegations of fraud, even more so, Evo comes out immediately and publicly and says, okay, I agree to a runoff. Let's have new elections. I'm willing to participate in new elections with Carlos Mesa as my opponent. But I think it was too little too late at that point, and there was kind of no stopping, you know, this huge movement that had been let loose. So the next day, on Sunday, the commander of the armed forces, a man named William Kaliman, comes out publicly and recommends that Evo Morales step aside. Okay, so the armed forces make an official recommendation that Evo resign, and he immediately, within hours, is on a plane. He flies first to Chimoré, which is in the Chapare in the coca growing region, which has always been kind of the base of his support. And we see images here of Evo sleeping on the ground at some kind of makeshift place in Chimoré where his plane landed, and just to see the president of a nation, someone who has led the country for nearly 14 years, within minutes we see him lying on the ground. Okay, so this is just, I think, so illustrative of what happened and how significant this was in this image here on the right of how fast and how far he fell. Okay, and I selected this image on the left of this graffiti because Evo really created himself as the people. He was the people. He was kind of this incarnation of the, you know, the working class and indigenous population of Bolivia. And here you have this sign that says Evo sin pueblo, Evo without his people. And that just happened so fast. And I have to say, even as someone who had become disillusioned with Evo and his leadership in the Mass Party, I can admit openly here that I did not vote for him. I didn't vote for anyone in the election, even though voting is obligatory. I submitted a blank ballot. Even though I did not vote for him and really questioned the legitimacy of his fourth candidacy, when I saw him step on that plane, there were tears pouring out of my eyes. Just everything that he stood for, everything that he represented, all of the very real and significant gains that were made that we can't lose track of, it did feel like that was being erased and delegitimized in an instant. And that was a real pain and a real grieving that the people of this country are living to this day. Okay, so, oops. A coup or not a coup? So I'm not going to pretend to answer this question for you, but I did invite a number of voices to come in and give their input on this question. So I'm going to play a short video now, just hearing a few other folks lend their words to this question. And these are all people that are kind of connected to me or to dragons, so perhaps not fully representative of the country as a whole, but I did want you to hear just some from other perspectives to shed light on this question. Okay. Okay, let me know if you can't see the video.
Si hubo o no golpe de Estado en Bolivia. Puedo afirmar que sí hubo golpe de Estado en Bolivia. 1. Se atropelló la ley constitucional en cuanto a la sucesión de gobierno. Esta ley indica que en ausencia del presidente, por muerte o por renuncia, etc., debe sucederle el presidente nato de la Asamblea, es decir, el vicepresidente del Estado. Como también renunció, debe sucederle el presidente o la presidenta de la Cámara de Senadores en una reunión, en una sesión extraordinaria de proclama con la asistencia del quórum reglamentario. Esto no pasó en la Asamblea Plurinacional. La actual gobernante no era presidenta de la Cámara de Senadores y el Congreso solo tenía la asistencia de 8 personas, entre senadores y diputados, de los más de 150 que conforman la misma. Entonces fue un atropello y una vulneración a la Constitución Política del Estado. Segunda razón, fue un golpe de Estado porque estaba sustentado por las Fuerzas Armadas y policiales, quienes no dejaron ingresar a la Asamblea a muchos diputados y senadores para la sesión de proclama a la que hice referencia. Es más, fue un militar quien impuso la banda presidencial a la actual presidencia para legitimar el golpe. Estas fuerzas fueron callando todas las manifestaciones que estaban contrarias a esta manera de actuar. 3. La vulneración a los derechos humanos tan flagrante, que es una característica de los golpes de Estado. Se ha amordazado a los medios de comunicación, se han cerrado radios comunitarias, existe persecución a los dirigentes de sindicatos y de vecinos, se ha judicializado la protesta, la opinión, el pensamiento distinto al del gobierno. Además, algo muy grave, se han formado fuerzas paramilitares para castigar y amedrentar a quienes se animen a disentir sus acciones.
Yo creo que sí ha sido un golpe de Estado, porque la presidenta ha sido elegida de una manera arbitraria y las Fuerzas Armadas le han dado la espalda al que era entonces presidente.
A coup is the removal of a government by violent and unconstitutional means. In that regard, when Evo Morales had to flee Bolivia because he had lost the support of the police and the armed forces, And the commander-in-chief of the armed forces appeared on national television inviting the president to resign. I think we can definitely identify that as the sign of a coup.
Desde mi perspectiva, sí pienso que ha habido golpe de Estado en Bolivia. ¿Por qué? Pues por la intervención importante de las Fuerzas Armadas, de los militares, toda su participación de intervención directa, ¿no? Y claramente hay otros factores también que se pueden mencionar, pero creo que lo más importante ha sido la intervención militar. Y que posteriormente han sido los propios militares que han posesionado al gobierno de facto que tenemos ahora.
Yo creo que es golpe de Estado, ¿no? Que la han obligado, ¿no? Que se salga, ¿no? Porque tenía que salir, ¿no? Y que se han ido, ¿no? Tenía que escaparse. Porque han recogido del helicóptero todo, ¿no? Porque si no le querían matar, le parece, ¿no? No sabemos todo bien tampoco, ¿no? No podemos juzgar nada.
El gobierno legítimo, constituido por Evo Morales, tuvo dos problemas. El primero de ellos fue que decidieron incumplir la constitución política del Estado y volver a participar Evo mismo, él como candidato a la presidencia cuando eso constitucionalmente estaba prohibido. Y a eso se añade que en las elecciones que llegó a haber en octubre ha habido muchísimas denuncias de fraude. Yo no estoy seguro de que hubiera habido fraude o no, pero sí estoy seguro de que era una candidatura ilegal. Entonces produce una movilización nacional que muchos, empezando por Evo Morales, le han llamado golpe de Estado y que no podemos considerar realmente golpe de Estado, porque no se ha visto nunca un golpe en el cual el resultado del golpe es que asume la presidencia una señora en la que nadie había pensado, pero era la que constitucionalmente estaba habilitada para ser sucesora, supuesto que además de renunciar Evo por toda esa movilización, renuncian también los principales dirigentes del MAS que tenían cargos importantes en el Estado. Y la presidenta, en una actitud que en principio hace buena impresión, después resulta que no tiene ni formación política ni capacidad suficiente, no solamente para dirigir el país, sino encima para ser candidata a la presidencia que se ha autoproclamado.
Okay. Were you all able to hear that and view that video okay? Yes? What happened to my chat box? It disappeared. There we go. So as you can see, it's a difficult question to answer. It's definitely not one of your traditional coups that we associate with violent regime change, where you have kind of tanks coming in and taking over and a military general assuming the presidency by force. That is certainly not what happened in Bolivia. A lot of people are using the language of a police, what is the word, of kind of a police instigated coup, or a soft coup is often language that's used. You know, I will say in the immediate aftermath of this happening, all of us were stunned. I mean, the nation as a whole was stunned. It was complete shock to see this unfold, to see it unfold as rapidly as it did, and deeply troubling and sad to see Evo's departure the way that it happened. And I think, you know, speaking from my own experience at the time, I'm not sure I would have called it a coup. I think I just felt, you know, I saw Evo Morales and Alvaro Linera, his vice president, on national television submitting their resignation. So that is not something that you would immediately associate with a coup d'etat, okay? But as more information has come to light subsequently, and we have all seen what's happened in the aftermath, I think I would say today that yes, you know, I do think that if the military comes in and recommends that a leader, you know, the military is meant to be apolitically, recommend that a leader step aside. That means that the armed forces has a role, and the assumption of the interim president was problematic and arguably not legal. So I'll speak a bit more about that now. I did also want to share this quote, and I have to say I'm not sure that Silvia Rivera would respond in the same way now, knowing what we know now, but I do think it sheds light on a perspective that you don't see represented in the international media and in the English language media. So Silvia Rivera Cusicanca, who is an Aymara political scientist and anthropologist and professor, she came out in the aftermath of Evo's resignation and said, "I do not believe in the two hypotheses that are being used. The triumphalism that with the fall of Evo we have recovered democracy seems to me an excess, an analysis that is getting out of focus. The second mistaken hypothesis, which seems extremely dangerous to me, is that of the coup d'etat, which simply wants to legitimize completely, with a package and everything all wrapped up in cellophane, the entire government of Evo Morales at its moment of greatest degradation. All this degradation, legitimizing it with the idea of a coup, is criminal, and therefore one must think how this degradation has begun." So I share that quote not necessarily saying that it's my position or even that it's the position that she would uphold at this time, but actually saying that it's a messy conversation, and the narrative of coup and of violent regime change really does paint Evo as a victim. And that is a very, very, very oversimplified story of what happened, okay? So, you know, he made some grave mistakes. He should never have run for a fourth term in office. It is very likely that he did get elected straight out and has a very strong sectors of support in this country, but it's clear, very evident that there was a huge layer of unsatisfaction under the surface that now has roared its angry head, and we're living now in a situation of just incredible polarization and uncertainty and even fear as a result. So the crisis of succession. I realized that I actually made an error in my little video, promotional video that I made for this presentation, where I refer to Jeanine Añez as the fourth in line of succession. She was actually the fifth person in line for succession, and it was a bit complicated to disentangle that and the whole story. You know, I'm not an attorney. We did hear a little bit from an attorney in one of the interviews, kind of speaking to the constitutionality of what happened, but I would say it was messy and a bit sinister and a bit kind of confusing how everything unfolded. So I will say that Evo, when he resigned, he left, and also his vice president, Álvaro Linera, also submitted his resignation at that time. Subsequently, the president of the Senate, who was a woman named Adriana Salvatierra, also submitted her resignation. And according to the constitutional line of succession in Bolivia, it goes president, vice president, then would be passed on to the president of the Senate. In the absence of the president of the Senate, it would then go to the Chamber of Deputies. In the absence of the Chamber of Deputies, you then go to the vice presidents of both the Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. And it just so happens that the president of the Senate, the head of the Chamber of Deputies, and the vice presidents of both of those bodies all resigned. So there was a mass exodus of these political leaders when Evo resigned. And that would leave Jeanine Añez, who was the second vice president of the Senate, potentially the next person in line. Now that was still kind of complicated and questionable, but she did stand up very immediately after Evo's departure and said, "I am prepared to take on leadership of the country." Now, was that planned? Was it orchestrated? We actually don't know. I'm not sure that we'll ever know if there was kind of this dark, sinister plan in place that Jeanine Añez was going to be the de facto leader of the country. But that is what happened. It has come out subsequently that Adriana Salvatierra, Victor Borda, these other high-ranking members of the MAS leadership have now come out publicly to say that they resigned because their lives were threatened and the lives of their families were threatened. And that lends credibility, I would say, to the coup narrative. I would also highlight, I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's a sociologist in preparation for this presentation, and I was asking her this question about the coup, and she kind of stopped me and said, I think that's not fertile territory. I don't think we need to be getting into the logistics and conversation right now about whether it was or not a coup. We have to deal with the reality that we're living in now. And I think that's true. But because there's so much misinformation and confusion in what's being reported about Bolivia, I did want to kind of just shed light on these events as they unfolded. Now, Jeanine Añez is a little known, I don't think virtually anybody in Bolivia had ever heard of her before all of this unfolded. She's from the Unión Democrática, which is a kind of right-leaning conservative party in Bolivia. She was a big, really vocal in her territory. She's from the Beni against Evo Morales and his leadership. And she's just kind of this little known senator that came forward and said that she was willing to accept the role. There was a session in the Constituent Assembly, essentially to make a decision about who would assume the presidency. And in that assembly, there was a lack of quorum. So what quorum means is the minimum number of representatives or of members of an assembly that must be present in order for the meeting to be valid. Now that quorum could not be met because, as you just heard in the previous video, medium speaking, there were only, I think, 8 members of the 150 members of the assembly who actually showed up and participated that day. And significantly, several members of the MAS party were physically barred from entering the building. So they could not participate, their voices weren't heard, and therefore there was a lack of quorum, which essentially made the proceedings invalid. Very quickly, Añez swears herself in as president. It is a member of the armed forces who lays the presidential sash across her body, and she enters into the presidential palace with a massive, massive Bible in her hands. Okay, so this is significant, it's symbolic, and it's a very, very major shift in leadership. So she's sworn in on November 12th, and I think it is important to mention now that Jeanine Añez has a past of speaking in very discriminatory terms about Indigenous people in this country. People have uncovered old tweets and statements that she's made about Indigenous traditions being satanic, about Indigenous people not being genuine for wearing shoes, just some really unsettling things, and we need to know these things about the people who claim to be our leaders. When Evo is sworn in, when Jeanine is sworn in, it unleashes massive protests. I mean, massive, massive protests, mostly in, Indigenous and largely working class neighborhoods and communities across the country. So you see, protests, uprisings in El Alto, in the zona sur of Cochabamba, and Plan 3000 of Santa Cruz, and Yapacani, in the Chapare. I mean, there's just a huge response to this situation. It also emerges later, and this wasn't public knowledge at the time, and it's this information has never been formally corroborated, but it does emerge later that there was a private meeting held in the National Catholic University building in La Paz, where some key individuals, including Camacho, who is the head of the civic committee in Santa Cruz, who I mentioned previously, Carlos Mesa, who was the other, the candidate who came in second in the elections, also Tuto Quiroga, who is a largely delegitimized kind of right-wing past vice president in the country, the ambassador of Brazil, who was considered to be representing the interests of Brazil and of the United States. A number of people met for a private meeting in the University of Catholic University of La Paz, and apparently in that meeting, Jeanine Añez was handpicked to be named the new president. So that is obviously not any kind of legal or transparent procedure. So you have here this image on the top, Jeanine Añez entering the presidential palace with a extremely large Bible. And then here you have Pumari, the leader of the Potosí Civic Committee, Camacho, the Santa Cruz Civic Committee, and this is a pastor coming into the presidential palace. In the moment that Jeanine is sworn in, they lay a Bible down on the floor in the entryway and say, Pachamama will never return to this palace. Bolivia belongs to Christ. And that is the beginning of the disintegration, systematic and strategic disintegration and separation of church and state in Bolivia today. In this image on the right, you can see some of the protests that emerged, but there were huge, huge, huge protests denouncing the illegitimacy of this assumption to the presidency and denouncing Evo's departure. And something also symbolic and significant happened in this moment is when Jeanine Añez is sworn in as president, many members of the armed forces, they pulled off or cut off the Huipala flag on their uniforms. So the Huipala is this multicolored checkered flag right here. It is considered a symbol of diversity in Bolivia, especially indigenous diversity, and Evo made it the second official flag of the country. Now, it is also a controversial symbol because it is largely considered to be more of a representation of highland indigenous populations and not necessarily representative of lowland indigenous populations, and definitely many members of the eastern part of Bolivia and the lowlands do not feel represented by this symbol. However, there are definitely racist undertones to tearing that symbol off of uniforms and burning it and cutting it, and that was very enraging for a lot of people across the country who saw and see to this day the Huipala symbol as a symbol of hope and diversity and representation for people who traditionally had been underrepresented. And I will say that we had a Huipala hanging outside of our program house in Bolivia, and we got a call from the landlord saying, you must come and take down the Huipala now or they're going to burn the house down. And there were vandals and people going out into the streets, and any association with the Huipala or with the mass government made you a target for attack, vandalism, etc. Okay. So heading into the first week of Añez's presidency, she comes out and says that she is going to have a firm hand, la mano dura, a hard hand at pacifying the country. Interestingly enough, pacification doesn't usually come with force and weapons. But that's what unfolded. So on she was sworn in on November 12th. On November 14th, she names her cabinet. Of that new cabinet, not a single member is of indigenous descent, and it is mostly made up of white, male members that represent interests in the eastern part of the country, and these were strategic alliances for people like Añez and Camacho, who wanted to see a return to essentially the way things were before. And Añez definitely uses this language of putting things back into their place. Right after the naming of the cabinet, one of the presidential ministers, this man named Arturo Murillo, who has become kind of one of the faces of the new regime, comes out and starts launching threats of sedition. And he makes a kind of a press conference and essentially says that if you are thought to be engaging in seditious acts, we will hunt you down, we will find you, and we will put you in jail. And being associated with sedition was equal to being associated with a mass party. On November 15th, the new regime comes out with a presidential decree that grants complete immunity to the armed forces. So this decree says that any collateral damage to pacifying the country by force will be given absolute 100% immunity. A number of human rights groups, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc., have come out and said that this was essentially a carte blanche for human rights abuses in Bolivia. And probably not coincidentally, the same day that that decree comes out, there is a massacre in Cochabamba in the community of Sacaba. So this is an area that's about 10 kilometers from the city of Cochabamba. And there was a big march, a protest from representatives of the Cocaleros and people from the Chapare who planned this march to the main plaza in Cochabamba, kind of in recognition of Evo Morales as their leader. The new government decided that they would not permit these protesters to enter the city of Cochabamba, and they put up a blockade on a strategic bridge, Puente Guayani, in the community of Sacaba, and there were violent confrontations. There's a lot of, this day is shrouded in a lot of secrecy and a lot of manipulation of events and the manipulation of media and testimony. But I will say that most members of, there were no international journalists permitted to be there, and any national journalists were on kind of the side of the armed forces in the sense that that's where they were physically located. So they really didn't have an up-close view of what happened when people started getting shot. So the images and the footage that we have are people who were in the midst of this mayhem, who were taking photos and images at the threat to their lives on their cell phones. And there were 9 people who were killed that day with bullet wounds. Most of those bullet wounds entered the head or neck. And all of the fatalities were on the side of the protesters, who were largely made up of indigenous peasants and farmers coming from the Chapare region. So there is, a significant paradigm here where you have members of the armed forces representing a white ruling class who are attacking and firing upon largely unarmed indigenous protesters. Now, there are lots of stories and variations to what occurred. The government has come out and said that the protesters were armed and were looking for violent confrontation. There is probably some truth to that, but it is well known that most of them were armed with sticks and stones and nothing more. And the official story, the official narrative of the government is that they shot themselves, okay? That these protesters were essentially so untrained, was the language that they used, the untrained, that they got confused at where they were shooting and they shot themselves in the head. Obviously, I take offense to that narrative. However, the ballistics report, the official ballistics report that came out days after the massacre, stated publicly and officially that the bullets were not military-grade bullets. Now, we will maybe never know exactly what happened, but we have testimony from people who were there. We do have footage. And it is clear that these people were being fired upon. They were fired upon from the direction where the military was located and also from helicopters who were flying above. And again, there were no fatalities on the side of the armed forces. Okay. Now on November 19th, so now we are a week into the new regime, there was a second massacre in Sancata, which is in El Alto on the outskirts of La Paz. El Alto is considered the kind of the Aymara indigenous capital of Bolivia and even of South America. And what occurred in Sancata was similar. There were protesters who were fired upon. There were 10 fatalities and dozens of wounded in the instance of Sancata. And what occurred there essentially was that there had been protests set up to protect and blockade a natural gas plant. And these protesters did not agree with the assumption of Jeanine Añez to power, and they wanted to restrict gas reserves being delivered to the city of La Paz. Now, the official line of the government is that these protesters were trying to set fire to the gas, this gas reserves, and that they were therefore terrorists. There's, again, very little evidence that that's the case, and testimony of people who were there that day and experienced what happened said that it was, it was a peaceful protest and they were essentially fired upon. Again, there were no wounded on the side of the armed forces. So this leads to a period that continues today of extreme polarization and social fragmentation in Bolivia. And I say that with so much pain and sadness. There's been strategic and overt political persecution. Essentially all leading members of the Mass Party have warrants out for their arrest. They've had to flee the country. They've had their homes violently attacked. They've had their homes burned down. They've received death threats. And so there's been a complete persecution and systematic criminalization and delegitimization of members of the Mass Party. There's been a lot of racialized language that has been used. Oftentimes protesters are referred to as savages, as hordes, this really kind of demeaning, dehumanizing, and racialized language to represent a lot of the, working class, popular sectors, and yes, indigenous sectors who have supported Evo Morales. There's been definitely a real tangible fear of anything that's different or the other, and the return of the old guard. I say here, by the old guard, I mean a lot of right-wing people who had been legitimized or maybe had, criminal cases out against them, who have now been welcomed to return to Bolivia with open arms. So that includes people like Manfred Reyes Villa, who is a ex-mayor of Cochabamba, governor of Cochabamba, Branko Marinkovic, who is a Croatian Bolivian white power leader who has now been welcomed back as kind of a consultant to the new government. Leyes was the disenfranchised and imprisoned mayor of Cochabamba. He was actually released from jail and put back into his post as mayor, which has been very controversial because he has now been embroiled in another scandal and has just been arrested again. And a number of these sinister figures who have come out of the woodwork and now taken on positions in the government or are candidates for the new elections. And to really problematize the situation even further, at the end of January, Jeanine Añez, her only mandate was to call for elections. Call for peaceful elections. In fact, constitutionally, she was obligated to call for elections within 90 days, to schedule elections within 90 days, her first 90 days in office. That, of course, didn't happen. Initially, elections were scheduled for May 3rd, which were, postponed because of the public health crisis. But Her only mandate was to call for elections, and she, at the end of December, came out and announced her candidacy for president as well. So not only is there, you know, this overt kind of repression occurring in the country and extreme control being exercised in light of the public health crisis, but simultaneously, the interim president is actively and incessantly campaigning for the presidency 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So everything we're hearing right now from the government, online, in the news is propaganda, essentially. And yeah, there was also a real demonization of the chapare, of cocaleros, as symbolizing kind of the excesses of the mass government. And really today, the term masista is, you know, also, you know, language that's used for narco, salvaje, people that are savages, who are drug traffickers, like a real active campaign to delegitimize the mass name and legacy and leadership. I'm just going to stop on this briefly, and for those of you who are getting antsy, I'm going to start to wrap up here. I think I have a couple questions that have come in. Parallels and connections between Añez and far-right governments in the US, Brazil, and other countries. There have been direct parallels and connections made between Camacho, who's this individual right here, Luis Fernando Camacho, who was one of the main figures in kind of the ouster of Evo Morales. He, in the months leading up to the election, he met with representatives of Marco Rubio in the United States. He met with representatives of the de facto government in Venezuela and in Brazil. So definitely he has had kind of some strategic plans in the works. He initially supported Añez as interim president, but now that they are opponents in the upcoming election, he has come out really vocally against her. Añez herself, I'm not sure she has kind of the degree of sophistication strategically or politically to be making those strategic alliances, but are they being made on her behalf? Absolutely, I think so. And Artillo Murillo, her minister, is one individual who's making that happen. Okay, moving along. Thanks for your patience, everyone. I know this is a lot of information I'm throwing at you. Oh, I guess I'll go back quickly. So these are the official candidates for the elections. Now, I do have to say that there's been no news about the elections really definitively since the public health crisis broke out. Like there was a law passed in Congress. Now the Mass Party still has a majority in Congress, so they passed a law that would require the government to schedule elections within 90 days. That would mean in August. But the interim government has come out very directly and publicly to say that is not going to happen, that it would be irresponsible given the current public health crisis. So we have no idea when elections will occur, but I do think that it is in the interest of this de facto government to postpone as long as possible. And I'm not sure it's worth commenting on these other candidates, but I will say that the candidate for the Mass Party is Luis Alberto Arce, who was the Minister of Economy under Evo Morales and is largely considered to be the architect of this economic system that has brought real prosperity and stability to the Bolivian economy these past years. I promise we're wrapping up, okay? So that brings us to today, to now, and I'm just going to touch briefly on the current situation of the COVID crisis and how it's unfolding in Bolivia. This is a quote from a philosopher, a Spanish philosopher, Paul Preciado, who has been writing some really interesting reflections on kind of the management of pandemic around the world right now. He's done a lot of research on the AIDS pandemic and how that was managed, and he says, "Tell me how your community builds its political sovereignty, and I will tell you what forms your epidemics will take and how you will face them." And that is absolutely true and what we are seeing unfolding right now. So these tendencies towards repression, towards violence, towards criminalization that we've seen from this interim government so far, those same tactics are being applied to the management of the public health crisis, okay? So that means we're living in a state of constant fear. The information, official information we're getting from the government is fear your neighbor, suspect everyone. If you trust anyone, you will be infected and probably die. I mean, that is the kind of feeling and language that we're hearing on the media. There is absolutely no sense of, you know, we need to come together, look out for one another, you know, in the face of this emergency, we're in this together. No, it's very much, you know, control of the population, restrictions on our liberties, on freedom of speech, on movement, and criminalization if you disobey. So all of the language that we're hearing now, just inundation on the media of language of discipline and obedience. And if you disobey, you will be punished. And punishment means jail time, means imprisonment, it means hefty fines. And the people that are being targeted, again, I will say, are people in working class neighborhoods, in more vulnerable neighborhoods, the people who most need support and protection and resources in a time of urgent need. So we began national quarantine in Bolivia on March 22nd. What that looks like is that only one adult member of the household is permitted to leave the house for a 4-hour window, 1 day a week. Your day is designated according to your national ID number. In order to go to the market, to go to the bank, you have to show your ID. Now this is starting to taper off. We're entering what's called a dynamic quarantine period. I will actually say a lot of people, there's been a significant loosening in the last week, but for really a 2-month period, more than 2 months, you know, people were not permitted to leave their homes. You can only leave by foot or by bicycle to go buy provisions for your family, and this is being actively controlled by the military. So there is military presence of the armed forces and the police in the streets managing the quarantine. I do want to say categorically that I believe that it is necessary to take a strict approach to the quarantine because of the weakened state of the medical system in Bolivia. I think there's, you know, real risk and vulnerability that that the medical system isn't going to be able to handle an increase in cases. However, I absolutely know and believe that that can be done without instigating fear and paranoia in the population as a whole and without targeting more vulnerable communities, which is what we are seeing here today. The government has approved a 500 Boliviano bono universal. There are some small bonuses that people can collect during this period of scarcity, but I can tell you that 500 Bolivianos does not feed your family for even a week, okay? So that is not enough for people who have been locked inside their homes for over 60 days. And going back to the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned the strength of the informal economy in Bolivia, and those are all people who do not have social safety nets. They do not have anything that they can lean back on in a moment of crisis, and we are entering into a situation where, you know, there is hunger and people cannot sustain the lockdown any longer. There was a decree announced on May 7th, essentially a restriction on free speech that actually came out and said that any person who released information of any form, whether it be written, printed, or artistic, that can put into effect, or that can affect, put at risk public health, will be charged according to the penal code. So that has been, you know, that was an overt restriction on free speech. A lot of journalists associations came out denouncing that decree, and actually there was so much bad press around it in Bolivia that the government had to rescind that decree recently. And there is a real and significant lack of reliable information about the pandemic in Bolivia. There was recently a study that came out that evaluated the response and information made available to the populations in all neighboring countries in South America. And it was very, very evident in that study that Bolivia essentially has the worst system of relaying information about what's going on during this public health crisis in all of South America, and even far behind Venezuela, which is a country facing, I think, even a more significant political crisis today. There's no reliable public information about the number of tests that are being done. There's, you know, the information that is being released it contradicts itself. So if you look at, you know, the Ministry of Health, or there's an application on people's cell phones. If you look at those numbers, they do not align. They contradict themselves. And there's a real lack of transparency, and also a real lack of capacity. So I'll mention that now as we start to wrap up. So we are seeing a de facto regime now in crisis. So as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a blurring of the division between church and state, which has continued. Our de facto president has come out on national television to tell the population that they should pray in order to protect themselves from COVID-19, and that if we pray enough, we will vanquish the virus. Restrictions on free speech, also the use of state apparatus for personal benefit. So there's been a number of scandals involving use of the presidential plane by Jeanine Añez's daughter in order to have a birthday party, and other scandalous activities like that. Also use of public funds and the state apparatus for her campaign, which I said is active and incessant. A number of very high profile scandals, which I won't get into now, but involving Intel and the hydrocarbons company, which both of their heads had to resign amidst extreme scandal and misuse of funds. Also, the government has used the public health crisis to push forward the legalization of GMOs in Bolivia, in a reality, in a context in which people cannot protest or even have a healthy public debate about what that would look like. And a very deficient management of the public health crisis. Bolivia has one of the highest mortality rates in the region. Like I said, militarization, criminalization, lack of basic medical infrastructure. And the most recent crisis that we're experiencing today involves a scandal of respirators that were purchased by the government. There was a purchase made of 170 respirators that were meant to go to intensive care units in Bolivia. When those respirators arrived, it turned out that they made a mistake and accidentally purchased limited use ambulance respirators that have absolutely no use in critical cases of COVID, absolutely no use for intensive care units. And subsequently, it came out that there was a massive overpricing of these respirators. So this came at a cost of the Bolivian government $5 million. And it turns out that they spent $170,000, they spent $27,000 per respirator on equipment that costs under $10,000. And the individual who made the order, submitted the order on those respirators, was the son-in-law of Jeanine Añez. So currently the Minister of Health in Bolivia has been imprisoned, and there's an active investigation around what happened. But meanwhile, that is money that has been stolen from Bolivian people who do not have the infrastructure, the support, the social safety nets that they need to wait out this crisis. Finally, again, the postponement of national elections, which is worrisome, and incessant campaigning coming from the government. So looking forward, I did want to share this quote. This is another quote from Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, and also an image that I think is just one example of creative protest in this time of crisis. Something that has been really encouraging to me to see and be a part of has been the growth of women's movements and collectives and voices and assemblies that have convened to speak out against what's happening here. In this image, you have a number of women who came together in a plaza in Cochabamba to protest the racism that has been occurring. And these women came out and said, we are all the children of Indigenous people. That is who we are. That is the makeup of this nation. It is something that we should be proud of as a part of our national identity, and you cannot erase that. You cannot erase that legacy, and you cannot erase what was gained over these last years. And this quote from Silvia Rivera, I think, highlights that narrative that I really want to tell you all today. Despite everything, in recent years, there has been a recognition and a self-recognition of the Indigenous as a moral force. Although it has been degraded to a certain extent by the mass government, in daily life, it is recognized that the Indigenous are valuable in terms of language, food, culture, and forms of community and solidarity. A whole series of collectives are featuring the Huipala to make it clear that we are not going to go back 17 years. Camacho has gone to the old government palace as if to say that this process of recognition and self-recognition did not exist, to try to cover the sun with a finger. But there is no going back. I love that line, to cover the sun with a finger. And I think that's so true, and something that we have to hold on to during these challenging times. As I end, I do want to share with you all a video of just a few more voices reflecting their feelings and experiences of the political crisis and the health crisis in Bolivia. So I'm going to leave it with that video and also with this image of strong women in protest, which I think is the future one that we should all get on board with. And I'm going to stay on for a question and answer period. If anyone has questions, I realize that this was a long presentation. I thank you so much for your participation and for being here today. And I'm also available if you want to reach out to me personally at any time. And we will be making a recording of this presentation available. So with that, I'm going to play one final video, and we'll stick around for some questions. So here, a few more words from some of our friends.
El país está viviendo un momento político decadente. Este gobierno transitorio es corrupto, es represor y existe mucho nepotismo. Es corrupto porque, por ejemplo, hasta ahora no se sabe cuánto dinero han gastado comprando unos respiradores y nadie da una explicación clara al respecto. Es represor porque, aprovechando la cuarentena, lo que está haciendo este gobierno es sacar leyes que están vulnerando los derechos humanos. Y eso no está bien. La gente no puede salir a protestar, por ejemplo, por la ley de libre transitabilidad de los transgénicos. Si salen a las calles, los meten a la cárcel. Existe mucho nepotismo porque la mayoría de la gente, la mayor parte de la gente que está trabajando ahora en el gobierno es gente allegada a la presidenta, muy cercana. Por eso yo creo y estoy segura de que este gobierno es decadente y, como dice Chomsky, es un gobierno patéticamente incapaz.
The response of the Bolivian government to the current global health crisis has been carried out.
I'm noticing that the sound is not lining up with the image, so I'm just going to pause and restart. I'm not sure why that's happening.
Disproportionately. The government has dictated.
We might have to see it like that. My apologies, but I'll keep it playing.
A very strict lockdown that has been reinforced by the police and the army. In many cases, the police has stopped people going to get essential goods. There are some instances where people going to the pharmacy to get medicine has been stopped and taken into custody. these people are mostly of indigenous descent or indigenous, and this shows how the main priority of the Bolivian government has been ethnic cleansing in this entire process, and not necessarily a response to the virus.
Bueno, Bolivia ha estado experimentando dos crisis al mismo tiempo, ¿no? La crisis política desde el año pasado, octubre, y la crisis sanitaria que es catastrófica, porque lamentablemente el gobierno improvisa acciones y la mayoría son desorganizadas y no coordinadas con sectores correspondientes.
Ay, ¿qué puedo pensar? Política, todo es política, ¿no? Todo quiere su parte, digamos, ¿no? No sé qué va a pasar en ahora, ¿no? La gente pide elecciones ahora, ¿no? Pero no sé. Y si sigue sin decidir cuándo va a ser las elecciones, yo creo que mucho enfrentamiento va a haber. Hay gente que en los campos están, o aquí en la ciudad, yo de los rincones estoy escuchando que están preparando que van a levantarse otra vez como en noviembre.
Fear and disinformation have been the tools that the government has been using to reinforce the quarantine. The people that have been protesting against the government measures have been only been accused of sedition. The government hasn't been clear on the responses and on the policies to respond to needs of the population, like food, healthcare, education, and all of these essential needs have been left on the air. And the only discourse that the government has is that everybody that is trying to oppose the things that they are doing, it's aligned with mass. And clear policies are needed, but they are not being proposed or explained clearly on national TV.
Lamentablemente esta crisis sanitaria también nos ha hecho ver las diferencias sociales tan grandes que siempre han habido, pero que ahora se ve más claramente o que se siente más claramente, o que la población lo puede percibir más claramente, esas desigualdades sociales, el racismo estructural, la discriminación y cero tolerancia hacia la opinión del otro.
Una persona de los campos no entraba a la casa de gobierno, digamos, ¿no? Y ahora hay gente, una paseña nunca ha pisado, digamos, el palacio, digamos, ¿no? Y ahora hay gente como eso, hasta con la barquita se entra y antes no, ni con una pollera no podías subir a un avión. Eso no había.
Esta cuarentena que nos ha llevado a esta crisis también nos ha llevado a una situación de miedo, a una situación de intolerancia y siento que ahora todos y todas los bolivianos necesitamos salir de eso, de perder ese miedo y confrontar esta situación tan difícil, repensar de cómo queremos el futuro para Bolivia.
Con esta enfermedad, la gente ya está traumada, o sea, tanta huevada que, perdón, pero que dicen en la tele que te están totalmente lavando el cerebro y te están metiendo el miedo.
La presidenta se ha esmerado en cometer error tras error, y en confiar en quien no podía confiar, y en nombrar ministros que luego resulta que no servían para nada. Y está manejando muy mal, no es culpa solo de ella, el grave problema de salud en el país, que siempre ha sido delicado y complicado, pero en este momento hay una actitud en sectores importantes de la sociedad boliviana que es insoportable. Luego ha habido este escándalo de los respiradores, ¿cómo le llamaban? Y ahora ya tenemos a un ministro preso por eso, y eso acaba de desacreditar al sistema de salud que de por sí es totalmente insuficiente en el país.
Con las elecciones yo creo que va a ganar más, digamos, ¿no? Y eso es lo que tienen mucho miedo, ¿no? Ellos que puede ganar, ¿no? El más. Y que por eso están atrasando ahora, ¿no?
Sí, para septiembre yo espero que sí, que podría ser. Y tiene que ser. La actual presidenta no tiene legitimidad constitucional, una presidenta interina, pero eso no es lo más grave. Lo más grave es que ha demostrado no tener la capacidad suficiente para entender lo que es este país y lo que requiere.
¿Cómo me siento yo actualmente? Como ciudadana de este país, me encuentro muy angustiada por la injusticia que ejerce el gobierno, sobre todo con las clases populares. No tiene nada de diferente con las otras dictaduras que me tocó vivir en el pasado. La violencia, la amenaza, la persecución, el robo. En suma, el crimen campea y esto me angustia y me llena de incertidumbre. ¿Qué sucederá mañana?
Okay, everyone. I thank you for your time. Feel free to sign off if you'd like, and I am just going to stick around for some questions. I did see a question come in. Is there a chance that the mass can win? You know, I did search pretty extensively for any kinds of new data coming out, any polls on Añez's popularity currently, and really none of that is being done because of the public health crisis. But I would say that the approval rating for Jeanine Añez is dropping precipitously. I think that perhaps she did have some support, and I don't see that being significant now, especially around all these recent scandals. I do think that the mass would probably win if there were elections tomorrow. And I also think that there are real, you know, there's real validity around some of the ways that the Mass Party has been delegitimized recently. So both there is a campaign that is violent and aggressive, but there is also real reason to be cautious about a mass leadership. I think those of you who stuck it out this long, I know it was a long presentation. I feel like these are topics that are really urgent to share right now. This is the moment more than ever that we need to be asking ourselves who we are and how we engage with, you know, with our government and the people around us and holding them accountable. So these are stories that I feel are very important to tell. And it's an historical moment, not just for Bolivia, but for the world. So I just want to express my solidarity with all the people that are experiencing a real crisis right now, and also my solidarity with what's happening in the U.S. currently with the death of George Floyd and what's occurring in Minneapolis. You know, this is a real moment where we need to stand up and hold people accountable. So thank you, everyone. It is such a pleasure to share this with you, and absolutely feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions. I wish you the best and have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are. Mahesh is asking a question about the relationship between the current government and neocolonialism. You know, I really loved what Doña Leticia said in the video there. She speaks about the government kind of putting things back in their place. And there is a real suggestion there that putting things back in their place is kind of returning to the old order. And a return to the old order is essentially neocolonialism, or imperialism or neo-imperialism or whatever you want to call it. So there are elements of that, and I think that there are some really sinister figures at play who are absolutely, you know, wanting to exert this return towards a neo-colonialist or a neoliberal system. I'm not sure that the government itself of Jeanine Añez is organized enough to be that strategic about it, but I do think that there are actors behind the scenes that are, and that's what worries me. Let's see. Oh, heard from some past students. That's so wonderful. Sí, seguiremos luchando contra todas las injusticias. Curious about the narrative that the U.S. intervening because of lithium interests and if that holds water. Yeah, so that is something that came out in some reporting. You know, there hasn't been anything substantiating that. I would say that interest around natural resources management are real, and that has definitely been the case for Camacho. Camacho comes from an agro-industrial family who has interest in natural resources in Bolivia, and so that's the case. When it comes to lithium, I don't think there's been any immediate and clear connections made, at least publicly, but that's not to say that it hasn't happened in the background. But I wouldn't say that it was kind of the impetus behind the regime change. Okay, well, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, everyone. Saludos y abrazos. Chao, chao.